Most of you watching this will spend your entire lives, every waking hour, every drop of sweat, working for just 1% of what I was handed the moment I took my first breath. I do not say this to boast. I do not say it to trigger your envy. I say it to tell you about the most seductive, high-definition lie ever sold to the human race. My name is Sultan. Once, that name was a master key that unlocked every door on this planet. Once, my name alone could freeze the gears of justice or ignite the fires of war. I was born into the house of Saad, a senior prince of the kingdom, a child of the desert sun and infinite oil. I lived in a palace in Riyadh where the walls were literally lined with gold leaf, and the air was cooled by the breath of 1,000 invisible servants. In my former life, time was measured by the ticking of a Patek Philippe on my wrist that cost more than an average neurosurgeon earns in a decade. I was a ghost in the world of the common man. I took my private Boeing 747 to Paris for breakfast, hopped over to a penthouse in New York for lunch, and returned to the deep dunes of the Rub al Khali for dinners served in silk tents scented with oud so pure it cost more than silver. People didn't just greet me, they bowed as if I were made of different atoms. When I whispered yes, rivers were diverted. When I shouted no, entire family lineages were erased from the social fabric. I was told from the cradle that I was the chosen one of God, that my staggering wealth was the ultimate sign of His divine favor. But I am here to tell you the secret they hide behind the marble walls. Inside those golden halls, my soul was a prisoner in a pitch-black cell, starving to death. I was the king of the world, but I was a beggar in the eyes of eternity. Today, I live in a 60-square-meter apartment as a refugee. I count my copper coins for tomorrow's bread. And yet, I have never been more royal. I have never been more free. Because I found my true crown on the night I lost every single thing I owned. It all began with a thirst for speed and a pride that tried to touch the face of God. The Saudi Arabia they show you on the 6 o'clock news, the one with the grand mosques and the strict morality, and the one I lived in were two entirely different planets. In my world, the laws of gravity and the laws of God were for the commoners, the workers, the masses. To the public, we were the pristine guardians of the faith. We were the strictest defenders of Sharia. My father, my uncles, my cousins, we stood in the front rows of the mosques every Friday, draped in gold-trimmed bishts, our faces masks of piety. We lectured the hungry on the virtues of fasting. We lectured the poor on the dangers of greed. But when the heavy palace gates slammed shut and the world was locked out, we worshipped a different God entirely, hedonism. Behind those fortress walls, and in our sprawling secret estates in London, Marbella, and Los Angeles, we lived in a way that would make the decadence of ancient Rome look like a monastery. We were the operators of a massive machine. We used religion as a remote control to keep the population in check, while we indulged in every forbidden fruit. The most expensive alcohols were smuggled into the kingdom in diplomatic containers. The world's top models were flown in on private charters like catering platters. We moved through life with the arrogance of immortals. I truly believed I was untouchable. I believed death was a tragedy that only happened to other people, the servants, the laborers, the weak. I was so blinded by my own reflection in the gold-plated mirrors that I thought I could bribe the angel of death himself. And yet, despite the perfumes, the parties, and the power, there was a hole in my heart. No rare diamond, no limited edition Ferrari, no amount of political influence could plug it. It was a vacuum that sucked the joy out of everything I touched. I remember nights in London, lying in a bed that cost $50,000, surrounded by every luxury imaginable, and yet feeling an icy wind blowing through my chest. Every night, as I laid my head on silk pillows, a voice would whisper in the dark, a voice I tried to drown out with music and wine. It said, "Sultan, you are a hollow man. You are a golden shell. Soon, the wind will blow, and you will turn to dust. And then, who will you be?" I hated that voice. I ran from it. I ran as fast as a four-wheel drive engine could take me. It was late December, 2019. The Riyadh night was sharp, cold, and dry as a bone. I was behind the wheel of a limited edition Ferrari, one of only 10 ever manufactured. It was a masterpiece of carbon fiber and ego. Next to me sat my cousin, Khalid. We were young, we were high on life and substances I am now too ashamed to name. Faster, Sultan. Khalid laughed, his voice cracking with adrenaline. Tonight, the desert belongs to us. Let's outrun the wind. We hit the empty expanse of the desert highway, a strip of black asphalt cutting through the ancient sands. I mashed the pedal to the floor. The roar of the V12 engine behind my head sounded like a choir of demons. It felt like we were tearing the very fabric of gravity. The digital needle climbed, 220, 260, 290, 310 kilometers per hour. The world outside the window vanished into a blur of gray and black streaks. In that moment, I wasn't just a prince. I was a god. I was the master of space and time. I felt a surge of power so intoxicating that I let out a scream of pure, arrogant joy. Then, out of the darkness, it appeared. A stalled flatbed truck, parked in the middle of the fast lane. No lights. No warning. A wall of rusted iron. I remember the split second when my heart stopped. There was no time to brake. I swerved, and the car didn't just turn, it took flight. I can still hear the sound, the high-pitched, metallic scream of $1 million machine grinding against asphalt at 3 times the speed of sound. The Ferrari flipped. Once. Twice. 5 times. It became a spinning fireball, a vortex of tangled metal and high-octane fuel. In that heartbeat, I felt my neck snap. I felt the heat of the flames licking my skin. And then, the noise stopped. The light went out. I thought it was over. I thought I had finally found the silence I had been running from. But that was where the real story began. Suddenly, the deafening noise was gone. The smell of burning rubber and blood vanished. I found myself suspended in the air, 10 meters above the highway. It was peaceful. Quiet. I looked down and saw the wreckage. The Ferrari was a mangled, flaming skeleton. I saw a body trapped in the driver's seat, a mess of scorched flesh and broken bones, pinned behind a steering column that had pierced through a chest. That's me, I thought with a strange, cold detachment. That's the prince. Khalid's spirit was hovering a few meters away. We looked at each other, but the arrogance was gone. His face was a mask of pure, naked terror. We couldn't speak, but I could sense his thoughts. He was looking at his own lifeless body and realizing the same thing I was. Our billions in the Swiss banks, our royal titles, our diplomatic passports, they were all burning in that metal heap. We couldn't take a single cent with us. The only thing I possessed in that moment was my filthy, pride-bloated soul. The sirens of the religious police began to wail in the distance, their red and blue lights reflecting off the sand. Prince Sultan! Prince Sultan, they were shouting as they pulled up. But I wasn't their prince anymore. I was a spectator to my own funeral. Then, the desert highway began to dissolve. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was a physical weight. The sky seemed to rip open like a piece of old cloth, and a vacuum of immense power began to pull me in. I tried to resist. I tried to scream for my father, for the king, for anyone. But my voice was gone. I was being pulled into an abyss of absolute, terrifying truth. I am warning you, this was not a dream. This was not a hallucination brought on by a lack of oxygen. I have been a man of science and a man of power, and I tell you, that realm was more real than the chair I am sitting on now. I found myself in a place that defied every human word. It was hot, but it wasn't a heat that burned the skin. It was a heat that boiled your memories, your regrets, your very essence. And then I saw them. I saw faces I knew. I saw men who had sat at my father's table. I saw business moguls who had owned half of London. I saw holy men who had preached to millions. But they weren't in their bespoke suits or their white thobes anymore. They were stripped bare. The most horrific part was the gold. I saw shadows of men covered in a thick, glowing substance that looked like molten gold. It clung to them like burning tar, heavy and suffocating. They were reaching out, trying to scrape it off, but the gold was part of them. It was the weight of every bribe they took, every person they cheated, every dollar they worshipped. They were screaming for the very things that were now their eternal chains. I looked for my privileged spot. I looked for a VIP section. I looked for my servants to come and bring me a glass of water. But there are no servants in that place. There is no royalty. There is only the truth of who you were when no one was watching. I realized then that I was headed for the same fate. I was a prince of that fire. I was a prince of that greed. And then, in the middle of that suffocating horror, a different light appeared. It wasn't the red glow of the fire or the yellow glare of the molten gold. It was a light so white, so pure, it felt like a surgical strike of holiness. A figure was walking through the fire. The flames didn't just part, they fled from him. He didn't wear a crown of gold, and he didn't have 1,000 servants. But the moment those eyes that held the beginning and the end of time, locked onto mine, I collapsed. Not to my knees, for I had no body, but my entire spirit folded under the weight of his authority. I knew exactly who he was. And I knew that for 33 years, I had been at war with the only one who actually loved me. When his eyes met mine, the universe as I knew it ceased to exist. In the kingdom, I had been taught to expect a prophet, a messenger who would weigh my deeds with a stern, analytical eye. But what I felt was not acceptance. I felt judgment. It wasn't a judgment of anger. It wasn't the petty wrath of a man. It was the judgment of absolute purity. It was like being a speck of coal dust placed inside a diamond. Every flaw, every dark crevice of my soul was suddenly illuminated by a light that didn't just shine on me, but through me. Standing before him, the realization hit me like a physical blow. My entire life had been a performance. Every prayer I had led in the Grand Mosque, every $1 million charity check I had signed while cameras flashed and journalists scribbled, it was all cardboard. It was all ash. I looked at the monument of my life and saw nothing but a pile of dead leaves. In my desperation, I tried to speak. I tried to summon the ghost of the man I used to be. I tried to use my royal title as a shield. In my mind, I was screaming, "Do you not know who I am? I am a prince of the house of Saud. I am a protector of the Holy Lands. I have funded 1,000 minarets." But the words died in my throat. In that light, titles are nothing but dust motes dancing in a sunbeam. He didn't see the prince, he saw the thief. He saw the man who had slept on silk while his heart was a barren desert of pride. He saw the man who used the name of God to gain the power of men. He didn't speak with a human voice. His thoughts entered my spirit like a tidal wave, resonant and undeniable. "Sultan," he said, and the sound of my name felt like it was creating me and dismantling me at the same time. "You have spent your life building a kingdom that can be burned by a single match. You have worn a crown made of blood, oil, and the sweat of the poor. But I am the king of the crown of thorns. My kingdom is not of this world, yet it is the only world that remains when the sun goes cold." Then, the scene shifted. He didn't just tell me the truth, he dragged my soul into the heart of the source. The glory of the celestial realm vanished, and I was shown a hill. It was dry, dusty, and smelled of iron and death. It looked remarkably like the outskirts of Riyadh at dusk, yet it was thousands of years older. I saw him there. But he wasn't the radiant, terrifying figure standing before me now. He was broken. He was unrecognizable. He was bleeding from 1,000 lashes, his flesh torn like a discarded garment. He was being mocked by men who were no different from me, men who thought they held power, men who thought they were protecting the status quo by murdering the truth. I saw the nails. I didn't just see them, I felt the vibration of the hammer in my own spirit. Every strike resonated through my being. In the world I came from, I was taught that Jesus was never crucified. We were told that God saved him at the last second, that a substitute took his place because a prophet of God could never be allowed to suffer such a shameful and weak death. We believed that God was too mighty to let his messenger be humiliated. We equated power with the absence of suffering. But as I watched, the truth shattered my heart into a million pieces. He wasn't trapped by the nails. He wasn't a victim of Roman steel. He was held there by a love so dense and so powerful that I realized the Ferrari I had driven was a toy, and the palaces I owned were sandcastles. He chose to stay. He looked at me from that cross, straight through time, through the layers of my pride, through the abyss of my sins, and I understood the great exchange. The Prince of Riyadh was the one who deserved that cross. I was the one who should have been nailed to that wood. But the King of Kings was the one taking the strike for me. That is grace. In my world, everything had a price. You bought loyalty, you bought land, you bought heaven with a calculated number of prayers and rituals. But here, in the heart of reality, the price was already paid by the only person who owed nothing. I was a billionaire who had been bankrupt, and he was the king who became a beggar to pay my debt. He then led me to a place that looked like a vast hall of glass, stretching into infinity. Inside were the books of life. He showed me mine. It was a massive, gold-embossed volume. I expected to see a ledger of my virtues, the mosques I had sponsored, the orphans I had sent checks to during Ramadan. But as the pages turned, I saw the truth behind the ink. I saw the pride in every stroke. I saw the hidden desire for people to whisper, "Look how pious the prince is." I saw that my charity was actually a bribe to God. Then he showed me another book. It was thin and humble. It belonged to a man I barely remembered, an old, withered man who worked as a street sweeper in one of my father's districts. A man I had driven past 1,000 times in my Ferrari, splashing him with mud without a second thought. His book was glowing with a light that hurt my eyes. When that man gave a single piece of bread to a starving dog in an alleyway, it was recorded in heaven as a cosmic treasure. When he whispered a sincere prayer for his neighbor in the dark, with no one to watch and no camera to record it, it shook the very foundations of the throne room. "Sultan," the king told me, and his voice was like a gentle thunder, "the world weighs what you have in your hand. I weigh what you give away in your heart. You were the richest man in your city, and yet your book is empty because you did nothing for me. This man was a beggar in your streets, but in my kingdom, he is a prince, and his house is a palace of light." The horror of my wasted life crushed me. I felt the weight of 33 years of arrogance. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to wash his feet with my tears and stay in that peace forever. I didn't want the gold anymore. I didn't want the throne. I just wanted him. "Lord," I whispered, "don't send me back. Please. If I go back to Riyadh, I am a dead man. My family, my country, they will kill me for knowing you. I cannot survive that world now that I have seen this one." He placed a hand on my spirit. It felt like the warmth of a summer sun and the immovable strength of a mountain. "You must go back," he said. "Your life was not spared for your own comfort. You are no longer a prince of the house of Saad. From this moment, you are my ambassador to the house of Ishmael. Tell them that the gate is no longer barred. Tell them that the king they fear is not a tyrant, but a father who has been waiting for them to come home. He showed me a vision that haunted me for years, thousands of my people, men in thobes, women in black abayas, wandering in a blistering, dry desert, dying of thirst for a water they didn't even know existed. He showed me that the matrix of religion had kept them blind, but that many were already waking up. They were having dreams of a man in white. I am calling my sons and daughters back from the sands, he said. Go. Tell them what you saw. Tell them I have paid the price. Suddenly, the peace was ripped away. Boom. It felt like being dropped from a skyscraper and shoved back into a suit made of cold lead that was 5 sizes too small. The pain was astronomical, every nerve ending in my body screamed at once. My chest felt like it had been crushed by the weight of a mountain. Beep. 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 The rhythmic, clinical chirping of machines. The stinging smell of ozone, antiseptic, and my own burnt flesh. I forced my eyes open. I was in a VIP suite at the King Faisal Specialist Hospital. The most expensive room in the country. My father was there, his face haggard. High-ranking members of the Royal Council were standing in the corners. They were all weeping, chanting prayers, thanking Allah for my miracle recovery. The prince is back, a doctor shouted, his voice cracking with relief. He was clinically dead for 6 minutes. His heart simply stopped, and now it has started again. This is a divine sign. A blessing upon the house. I looked at my father, a man I had feared my whole life. He reached for my hand, his palm trembling. My son, he whispered, Allah has preserved you because you are destined to lead this kingdom. You have been given a second life to serve the faith. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and shout, Father, we are all blind. Everything we are building is a tomb. I saw the true king. But as I looked around the room, at the armed guards by the door, at the gold-trimmed curtains that cost more than a village, at the sheer weight of the power concentrated in that space, the reality of my mission hit me. I wasn't Sultan the Prince anymore. I was a spy in the house of the enemy. I was a child of the light trapped in the deepest heart of the matrix. My lungs burned as I took my first real, agonizing breath. I squeezed my father's hand, but in my spirit, I was reaching out for the hand of the man in white. Yes, I whispered, my voice sounding like broken glass. I am back. But I promise you, everything has changed. Returning to the palace after those 6 minutes of death was like being a ghost haunting my own life. Everything looked identical to the day before the crash, the fleets of armored black SUVs, the marble hallways that echoed with the synchronized footsteps of Sudanese guards, the heavy, suffocating scent of oud and frankincense. But I was seeing it all through resurrected eyes. To everyone else, this was the peak of human achievement. To me, it looked like a gilded graveyard. A very expensive, very beautiful tomb where souls went to suffocate under the weight of gold. My father and the Royal Council expected me to be transformed by my miracle. They assumed that surviving a 300 km/h fireball meant I was now a chosen vessel of the state's religion. They wanted me to be a propaganda tool, the prince who was spared by Allah. I had no choice. I had to wear the mask. Every single day was a masterclass in psychological warfare. I stood in the Grand Mosque, shoulder to shoulder with men who would have called for my head if they knew my heart. I bowed, I prostrated, I moved through the rockets with mechanical precision. But while their hearts were focused on the ritual, I was whispering the name of Jesus in the sanctuary of my mind. I was a spy in my own home. Every meal was a minefield. Every Allahu Akbar echoing from the minarets was a reminder of the price of my secret. I knew that in the house of Saud, for a senior prince to commit apostasy isn't just a sin, it's a systemic glitch that must be deleted. There is only one way they cleanse that stain, a cold blade in the public square. I lived with a knot of ice in my stomach, but the light I had seen in the abyss was a sun that never set, and it made the threat of the sword look like a toy. The King of Kings told me to tell my people, but I realized I didn't even know the word myself. I had billions of dollars, but I couldn't walk into a bookstore in Riyadh and ask for a Bible. In that city, an unauthorized Bible is treated with more terror than a suitcase nuke. I began to use my private, high-level encrypted satellite connection, the one usually reserved for discreet international arms deals or oil negotiations, to bypass the state's great firewall. My pulse would race so fast I could hear it in my ears, a frantic drumbeat of treason. I typed queries into the void. Who is the man in white? The Gospel of the Prince of Peace. Did Jesus die in Riyadh? I stayed up until 4 a.m. in my private library, a room filled with ancient Islamic texts, while I read the New Testament on a hidden, encrypted partition of my laptop. Every verse of the Sermon on the Mount felt like a cooling rain hitting a parched desert. I realized that the Isa I had been taught about, the prophet who was merely a precursor to Muhammad, was a shadow, a two-dimensional sketch. The real Jesus was a cosmic fire. He was the king who didn't demand the blood of his enemies but offered his own. I stopped reciting and started praying. It wasn't the 5 times a day ritual toward Mecca. It was an unfiltered, raw conversation. I would sit on my balcony overlooking the Riyadh skyline, watching the neon lights of the skyscrapers compete with the ancient stars, and I would say, Lord, I am a prince of a dying world. I am a slave to this gold. Teach me how to be a servant of yours. Teach me how to dismantle this matrix from the inside. One afternoon, about a month after the crash, I was sitting in the royal gardens, surrounded by peacocks and imported palms. A young worker from the Philippines, a man named Gabriel who had cleaned my pool for 3 years, was trimming the hedges. In my old life, Gabriel didn't exist. He was part of the landscape, like a stone or a sprinkler. I had never once looked him in the eye. But that day, the overview effect of my death experience kicked in. I saw him. Really saw him. He was humming a melody under his breath, a melody that sent a jolt of electricity through my spine. It was the same celestial frequency I had heard in the gateway during my death. I waited until the palace guards moved to the far side of the courtyard. I walked up to him. Gabriel froze, his shears trembling. He bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the grass. "Your Highness," he whispered, his voice thick with the fear that a prince's attention usually brings trouble. "Gabriel," I said, using his name. He looked up, his eyes wide with shock. No one in the family ever used the names of the third country nationals. "That song," I whispered, leaning in so the microphones in the trees wouldn't pick it up. "Where did you learn it?" He turned the color of ash. He knew that proselytizing was a death sentence. It is just a folk song from my village, sir. A simple song." I looked him in the eyes of a brother, not a servant. "I heard that song in the light, Gabriel. I heard it when my heart stopped on the highway. I saw the man in white." Gabriel's shears hit the grass with a thud. He looked around frantically, then back at me, tears streaming down his weathered face. "You saw the Lord?" he breathed, his voice a tiny spark of hope. "I saw him," I replied. In that moment, the matrix of the kingdom collapsed. The prince and the pool cleaner were no longer on different levels of a hierarchy. We were citizens of the same invisible country. Gabriel told me the secret. There was an entire underground network of invisible people, laborers, maids, drivers, who met in the humid, concrete basements of the servant quarters at midnight to worship. I, a prince of the royal blood, began sneaking out of my quarters at 2 a.m., dressed in a common worker's jumpsuit, to sit on a dirty floor with people I used to ignore. They didn't have gold, but they had the presence. They taught me more about the heart of God in those basement fogs than any royal cleric had in 30 years. My mission wasn't just to hide, it was to subvert. I began to change the way I spoke in the royal council. When my father and his advisors discussed cleansing a rebellious district or imposing harsher morality laws, I began to speak a language they didn't recognize. I used Islamic terminology to mask the heart of Christ. I would say, "Is not Allah called the most merciful? If we are His representatives, does our lack of mercy not make us liars?" My father, a man of iron and tradition, began to look at me with growing suspicion. "Sultan," he said during a private dinner, "you returned from the dead with the heart of a poet. You speak like a man who has lost his edge. This compassion you preach, it is a Western rot. It makes a king look weak." I looked at him, a man I loved, but a man who was a prisoner of his own throne. "No, father," I said quietly. "It takes more strength to forgive a beggar than to execute 1,000 rebels. I have seen what real power looks like, and it doesn't need a sword to prove its point." I started using my prince's allowance, money that was supposed to go toward yachts and mistress apartments, to secretly fund the legal defense of those caught in the religious courts. I funneled millions into underground networks that provided food and medicine to the very laborers we exploited. I was using the kingdom's own oil wealth to build the kingdom of the man in white. I was a Robin Hood and a Thobe, stealing from the darkness to give to the light. But Riyadh is a city of eyes. The Mutaween, the religious police, and the internal intelligence services began to notice my irregularities. They saw that I was no longer visiting the high-ranking clerics. They saw the pings on my satellite connection. They saw a prince of the House of Saud spending time in the servant quarters. One night, my cousin Khalid, the one who had survived the crash with me, came to my private study. He looked haunted. His eyes were sunken, and he was trembling. "Sultan," he said, locking the doors and drawing the heavy velvet curtains. "I can't do it anymore. I saw the fire that night. I saw the gold melting onto the faces of our ancestors. I haven't slept in 3 months. Every time I close my eyes, I feel the heat. But you are different. You have a peace that makes me want to scream. Tell me, Sultan, what did you see that I didn't? Why aren't you afraid?" I looked at Khalid. I knew the danger. If I told him and he wasn't truly ready, the pressure of the family would force him to betray me. But I remembered the man in white's command, "Go. Tell them." "Khalid," I said, placing my hand on his shoulder. "The fire you saw was the reality of the life we've lived. But there is a man who can walk through that fire. He is the only one who can wash the molten gold off your soul. He is the true king." Before I could finish, the heavy oak doors of my study were kicked open. It wasn't a servant. It was the chief of the palace guard, backed by 4 men with submachine guns. Behind them stood my father's chief of intelligence, holding my encrypted laptop in his hand. "Your Highness," the intelligence officer said, his voice as cold as a desert night. "The Emir has been patient with your trauma. But your digital footprints have led us to a place from which there is no return. You have been communicating with the infidel networks. You have been reading the forbidden scripts." He turned the laptop screen toward me. It was open to the Gospel of John. "The Emir requires your presence in the deep council room." "Immediately," he said. I looked at Khalid, who had fallen to his knees in terror. I looked at the hidden compartment in my wall where my small, wooden cross was kept. I realized my time as a spy was over. The mask was burned. The prince was dead. "Don't be afraid, Khalid," I said, standing tall and letting the guards grab my arms. "The king is finally calling me to testify." They didn't take me to a public courtroom. In the House of Saud, you don't put a senior prince on trial in front of the world. You don't let the masses see a crack in the royal facade. You settle it in the shadows, in the cold, silent places where the blood can be washed away from the marble floors before the sun rises to greet the faithful. I was led down into the deep council room, a bunker-like hall buried 3 stories beneath the palace. It was designed to withstand a nuclear blast, but its more frequent use was to silence those who threatened the spiritual and political status quo. The elevator ride felt like a descent into the grave. The room was freezing. The air was filtered and conditioned to a clinical, artificial sharpness that made my lungs ache. At the center of the hall sat a crescent-shaped table of dark, polished mahogany. Behind it sat 7 men. In the center was my father, the Emir. His face was no longer that of the grieving parent who had wept by my hospital bed. It was a mask of ancient, unyielding stone. To his left and right were the high clerics, the grand guardians of the faith. These were men whose beards reached their chests, whose eyes were sharpened by decades of judging others, and whose hearts were as hard as the desert flint. On the table before them lay the evidence of my treason. My encrypted laptop, my handwritten journals, and the small, plain wooden cross they had ripped from my bedroom wall during the raid. They looked at that tiny piece of wood as if it were a high-yield explosive. "Sultan," my father began, his voice echoing in the hollow chamber like a gavel. "We have pampered you. We have given you the keys to every pleasure in this world. We tried to blame your recent eccentricities on the trauma of the accident. We wanted to believe your brain was simply scarred. But this..." He pointed a trembling, ring-laden finger at the Bible. "This is the ultimate betrayal of your blood. Tell us now that this is a hallucination. Tell us you were confused by the morphine. Recant, and we will tell the people you are going away to Switzerland for medical treatment. Refuse, and you know the law of our ancestors. You know what happens to the branch that rots on the royal tree." I stood there, my wrists bound in cold steel, my body still aching from the Ferrari crash. But for the first time in 33 years, I felt like the only free man in that room. I looked at the clerics, who were already whispering verses of judgment and fire. Then I looked straight into my father's eyes, the man who had given me life, and the man who was now authorized to take it. "Father," I said, my voice steady, fueled by a frequency of peace that didn't belong to this world. "When the Ferrari hit that truck at 300 kilometers per hour, I didn't just break my body. I broke the matrix we have lived in for generations. I died. I left this world of sand, oil, and shadows, and I stood before the King of Kings." One of the clerics, a man whose name was feared across the Middle East, slammed his fist on the table. "Blasphemy! Kafir! There is no king but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. You speak of the Prophet Isa as if he were a god. You have been poisoned by the West." "I speak of him as he is," I replied, turning to face the cleric. I felt the spirit of the man in white standing right behind me. I saw the fire, Sheikh. I saw the gold melting onto the faces of our ancestors because they worshipped the gift instead of the giver. And I saw the man in white walk through that fire, not to judge me, but to pull me out of the wreckage. He showed me the cross. He showed me the event you spend your entire lives denying because it offends your pride. He didn't just send a message, he became the sacrifice. He is not just a prophet to be honored, he is the door that you have spent centuries trying to lock. The room went deathly silent. To speak of the cross in the deep council of Riyadh was to sign a death warrant in ink made of your own blood. My father's eyes filled with a terrifying, agonizing mix of grief and fury. "You would trade your heritage," my father whispered. "You would trade your family, your future, and your very head for a dead man's myth?" "He isn't dead, father," I whispered back, my heart breaking for him. "That's the truth that terrifies this council. He is more alive than anyone in this room." The trial lasted 3 grueling hours. They tried everything to break me. First, they tried logic, pointing out the contradictions they believed existed in my new faith. Then, they tried threats, describing the slow, agonizing process of an apostate's end. Finally, They tried the most potent weapon of all, my mother. They told me she was in the upper quarters of the palace, wailing and tearing her black abaya because her firstborn son had become an infidel. They said her shame was so great she had sworn to never eat again until I recanted. That was the blow that almost brought me to my knees. My heart felt like it was being shredded by 1,000 knives. But every time I felt my resolve flicker, I remembered the library of souls. I remembered the street sweeper. I realized that if I chose my royal life, my mother's comfort, or my father's approval over the truth, I would be choosing the molten gold. I would be choosing the fire. Finally, the eldest cleric stood, his shadow looming long against the marble wall. Sultan bin, name, you have confessed to the highest apostasy. You have rejected the seal of the prophets. By the laws of this land and the traditions of the desert, you are no longer a prince. You are no longer a son. You are a stain on the house. You are hereby sentenced to Alfana, total erasure. In the house of Saad, Alfana doesn't always mean a public execution. That can be too messy for a senior prince. It means you are disappeared. You are taken to a black site in the empty quarter, the Rub al-Khali, where the world forgets you ever existed. Your name is removed from the records. Your photos are burned. You become a non-person, breathing air in a hole until you finally stop. My father looked at me one last time. I saw a single tear escape his eye before he hardened his gaze into a mask of stone. He turned his back on me. Take the Kaffir, he commanded. He is no longer of my blood. I was thrown into the back of a windowless, armored van. My hands and feet were shackled. We drove for 6 hours into the deep desert. I knew the direction. We were heading toward the heart of the sands, the place where the dunes are mountains and the wind screams like a ghost. I began to pray, not for my rescue, but for my endurance. Lord, if this is where the ambassador's journey ends, let my blood be a seed. Let my family remember the peace I had when they took my head. Around 3 a.m., in the middle of a pitch-black stretch of dunes, the van suddenly swerved. I heard the screech of tires on gravel, the frantic shouting of the guards, and then a heavy, metallic impact. The van rolled onto its side. The back doors were kicked open. I braced myself for a bullet. Instead, I saw a face that made my heart leap. It was Gabriel, the pool cleaner. He was wearing a desert scarf, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. Behind him were 3 other workers from the palace, men I had sat with on the concrete floor of the basement. They were holding old assault rifles and a set of keys they had liberated from the palace motor pool. Sultan. We have you. Gabriel gasped, his hands trembling as he unlocked my shackles. We have a truck hidden in the wadi 5 miles from here. We have a brother at the Jordanian border who is waiting. We must move before the drones reset. Why? I asked, stunned as I crawled out of the wreckage. Gabriel, they will hunt you to the ends of the earth for this. Why risk your lives for me? Gabriel looked at me, and in the moonlight, I saw the same peace I had seen in the celestial halls of heaven. You sat on the floor with us, Sultan, he said softly. You called us brothers when the world called us slaves. In the kingdom of our Lord, we do not leave a prince behind. You are his voice. You must live to speak it. They had risked everything, their meager salaries, their safety, their very lives, for a man who had ignored them for 30 years. That was the power of the cross in the middle of the desert. We raced through the desert under the cover of a sudden, violent sandstorm, a gift from the king, as Gabriel called it. The swirling sand blinded the thermal sensors of the border drones and muffled the sound of our engine. We moved through ancient, dried-up riverbeds, following paths known only to the Bedouins and the laborers who had memorized the stars. As we reached the final ridge before the Jordanian no-man's land, I turned to Gabriel. I tried to pull the heavy gold signet ring from my finger, the last symbol of my royal identity. I wanted him to take it, to sell it, to buy his family's freedom. Gabriel pushed my hand away, a humble smile on his face. I don't want the gold, Sultan. I have seen the gold of the world, it is heavy. I want the crown you told us about. Just get to the west. Tell the world what is happening behind the walls. Break the matrix for the others who are still sleeping. I stepped across the invisible line into the darkness of the frontier, leaving behind billions of dollars, the palaces of my youth, and the name Sultan the Prince. I was a man with nothing, no passport, no money, no title. But as the first rays of the sun began to bleed over the Jordanian hills, painting the desert in shades of violet and gold, I looked at the horizon and saw the light again. It was the same light from the crash. I was no longer a prince of a dying kingdom. I was Sultan the Witness. And the testimony that would shake my father's throne was just beginning. They didn't take me to a public courtroom. In the House of Saud, you don't put a senior prince on trial in front of the world. You don't let the masses see a crack in the royal facade. You settle it in the shadows, in the cold, silent places where the blood can be washed away from the marble floors before the sun rises to greet the faithful. I was led down into the deep council room, a bunker-like hall buried 3 stories beneath the palace. It was designed to withstand a nuclear blast, but its more frequent use was to silence those who threatened the spiritual and political status quo. The elevator ride felt like a descent into the grave. The gold-plated doors closed, and for a moment, I was alone with my fear. I whispered his name, and suddenly, the elevator didn't feel like a cage, it felt like a chariot. The room was freezing. The air was filtered and conditioned to a clinical, artificial sharpness that made my lungs ache. At the center of the hall sat a crescent-shaped table of dark, polished mahogany. Behind it sat 7 men. In the center was my father, the Emir. His face was no longer that of the grieving parent who had wept by my hospital bed, it was a mask of ancient, unyielding stone. To his left and right were the high clerics, the grand guardians of the faith. These were men whose beards reached their chests and whose hearts were as hard as the desert flint. On the table before them lay the evidence of my treason. My encrypted laptop, my handwritten journals, and the small, plain wooden cross they had ripped from my bedroom wall during the raid. They looked at that tiny piece of wood as if it were a high-yield explosive. I stood there, my wrists bound in cold steel, my body still aching from the Ferrari crash. But for the first time in 33 years, I felt like the only free man in that room. I looked at the clerics, who were already whispering verses of judgment and fire. Then I looked straight into my father's eyes, the man who had given me life, and the man who was now authorized to take it. Sultan, my father began, his voice echoing like a gavel. We have pampered you. We tried to blame your recent eccentricities on the trauma of the accident. We wanted to believe your brain was simply scarred. But this. He pointed a trembling, ring-laden finger at the Bible, this is the ultimate betrayal of your blood. Recant, and we will tell the people you are going away for medical treatment. Refuse, and you know what happens to the branch that rots on the royal tree. Father, I said, my voice steady, fueled by a frequency of peace that didn't belong to this world. When the Ferrari hit that truck, I didn't just break my body. I broke the matrix we have lived in for generations. I died. I left this world of sand and shadows, and I stood before the King of Kings. One of the clerics slammed his fist on the table. Blasphemy. Kafir. You speak of the Prophet Isa as if he were a god. I speak of him as he is, I replied. I saw the fire, Sheik. I saw the gold melting onto the faces of those who worshipped power. And I saw the man in white walk through that fire to pull me out. He showed me the cross, the event you spend your entire lives denying. He became the sacrifice. He is the door that you have spent centuries trying to lock. The room went deathly silent. To speak of the cross in the deep council was to sign a death warrant. My father's eyes filled with a terrifying mix of grief and fury. You would trade your heritage for a dead man's myth? He isn't dead, father, I whispered. That's the truth that terrifies this council. He is more alive than anyone in this room. The trial lasted 3 grueling hours. They tried everything to break me. First, they tried logic, then threats, and finally, the most potent weapon of all, my mother. They told me she was wailing in the upper quarters, tearing her black abaya because her firstborn son had become an infidel. That was the blow that almost brought me to my knees. My heart felt like it was being shredded. But every time I felt my resolve flicker, I remembered the Library of Souls. I realized that if I chose my royal life or my father's approval over the truth, I would be choosing the molten gold. Finally, the eldest cleric stood. Sultan bin, name, you have confessed to the highest apostasy. You are no longer a prince. You are no longer a son. You are a stain on the house. You are hereby sentenced to Alfana, total erasure. In the house of Saad, Alfana means you are disappeared. You are taken to a black site in the empty quarter, the Rub al-Khali, where the world forgets you ever existed. Your name is removed from records. Your photos are burned. You become a non-person. My father looked at me one last time. I saw a single tear escape his eye before he hardened his gaze into a mask of stone. He turned his back on me. Take the Kaffir, he commanded. He is no longer of my blood. I was thrown into the back of a windowless, armored van. My hands and feet were shackled. We drove for 6 hours into the deep desert, toward the heart of the sands where the dunes are mountains. I began to pray, not for my rescue, but for my endurance. Lord, if this is where the journey ends, let my blood be a seed. Around 3 a.m., in the middle of a pitch-black stretch of dunes, the van suddenly swerved. I heard the screech of tires, the frantic shouting of the guards, and then a heavy, metallic impact. The van rolled onto its side. The back doors were kicked open. I braced myself for a bullet. Instead, I saw a face that made my heart leap. It was Gabriel, the pool cleaner. He was wearing a desert scarf, his eyes bloodshot. Behind him were 3 other workers from the palace, men I had sat with on the concrete floor of the basement. They were holding old assault rifles and a set of keys they had liberated from the palace motor pool. Sultan. We have you. Gabriel gasped, his hands trembling as he unlocked my shackles. We have a truck hidden in the wadi. We have a brother at the Jordanian border who is waiting. We must move. Why? I asked, stunned. Gabriel, they will hunt you for this. Why risk everything for me? Gabriel looked at me, and in the moonlight, I saw the same peace I had seen in heaven. You sat on the floor with us, Sultan, he said softly. You called us brothers when the world called us slaves. In the kingdom of our Lord, we do not leave a prince behind. You are his voice. You must live to speak it. We raced through the desert under the cover of a sudden, violent sandstorm, a gift from the king, as Gabriel called it. The swirling sand blinded the thermal sensors of the border drones and muffled the sound of our engine. As we reached the final ridge before the Jordanian no-man's land, I tried to pull the heavy gold signet ring from my finger, the last symbol of my royal identity, to give to Gabriel. He pushed my hand away. I don't want the gold, Sultan. I have seen the gold of the world, it is heavy. I want the crown you told us about. Just get to the west. Break the matrix for the others who are still sleeping. I stepped across the invisible line into the darkness of the frontier, leaving behind billions of dollars and the name Sultan the Prince. I was a man with nothing, no passport, no money, no title. But as the first rays of the sun began to bleed over the Jordanian hills, painting the desert in shades of violet and gold, I looked at the horizon and saw the light again. I was no longer a prince of a dying kingdom. I was Sultan the Witness. And the testimony that would shake my father's throne was just beginning. Here is the high-depth expansion of Chapter 6. This chapter transitions from the physical desert to the digital battlefield, focusing on the redemption through labor and the birth of a spiritual revolution. When I first touched European soil, I was a man who didn't exist. To the kingdom, I was erased, a non-person whose records had been purged from the royal archives. To the west, I was just another anonymous face in a sea of refugees. I spent my first months in a crowded shelter, sleeping on a thin, plastic mattress in a room that smelled of damp coats and desperation. The other men in the shelter spent their days complaining. They missed their homes, their status, their comforts. But I just sat there and smiled. I would look at a piece of dry, cheap bread in my hand and remember the molten gold of the abyss. I would look at the cold, gray sky and remember the King of Kings. For the first time in 33 years, I wasn't eating the bread of a prince, bought with the labor of others. I was eating the bread of a free man. Every day spent in that shelter felt like a baptism. I was being stripped of Sultan the Prince, and being forged into Sultan the Witness. But the peace was a preparation, not a destination. I remembered the command that vibrated in my soul: go. Tell them. I realized my survival wasn't a ticket to a quiet life, it was a mobilization order. I was a child of the light behind enemy lines, and the matrix of lies that held my people captive was still standing. I didn't need a Ferrari or a throne to fight. I needed a camera, a connection, and the truth. I found a job washing dishes in the back of a humid, cramped Turkish cafe in Nukholm. The steam from the industrial dishwasher reminded me of the heat of the crash, but it didn't scare me anymore. I worked 16-hour shifts until my hands were cracked and my back felt like it was made of broken glass. The owner called me ya Habibi and had no idea he was ordering a prince of the House of Saud to scrub burnt grease off pans. I saved every single cent. I didn't buy new clothes. I didn't buy a smartphone. I lived on the leftovers from the kitchen. I saved until I could buy a used, high-performance laptop and a professional microphone from a flea market. I taught myself how to use deep web VPNs and encrypted satellite bridges, the digital version of the desert paths Gabriel had shown me. I found a corner of the internet where the kingdom's firewalls were thin. I created a channel called The Prince of Ashes. The first video I posted was simple. I sat in a dark corner of my basement apartment. I didn't hide my face behind a mask. I didn't distort my voice. I spoke in the refined, unmistakable dialect of the Riyadh elite. I spoke the language of the palaces, but I spoke the truth of the pits. My brothers, my sisters, I said into that cheap microphone. You know my face. You were told I died in a tragic accident on the desert highway. You were told I was a martyr. But I am here to tell you that the prince you knew is indeed dead, but the man speaking to you is truly alive. I told them about the crash. I told them about the fire. But most importantly, I told them about the man in white. I explained the great exchange, how I, a billionaire, was spiritually bankrupt, and how a king who became a beggar paid my debt. I told them that the rituals they performed out of fear were empty, and that the God they were taught to fear as a tyrant was actually a father waiting for them at the end of the road. The video went viral within 48 hours. It wasn't just a video, it was a spiritual earthquake. In Riyadh, it was being watched in the back of high-end Maybachs and on the cracked screens of laborers. People were watching it in secret, behind locked doors, on their phones during the Friday prayers at the Grand Mosque. The dead prince had returned from the void with a message that threatened to dismantle the very foundation of the royal council. The matrix was glitching, and for the first time, my people were seeing the code. You do not challenge the House of Saud and expect a long life. Within a week, The bounty on my head was larger than the GDP of some small nations. I wasn't just a political dissident, I was a theological virus. I was the chosen one who had escaped the system, and now I was trying to wake up the others. The kingdom sent the cleaners, elite, deep-cover operatives trained to make problems disappear in European cities. I had to become a phantom. I moved every 3 nights, carrying my laptop like a holy relic. I learned to sleep with one eye open and my back to the door. I saw the black SUVs with tinted windows idling at the end of my street. I heard the rhythmic clicks on my phone line. One night, as I was walking back to my apartment through a dark alley in Kreuzberg, a man stepped out of the shadows. He had the unmistakable look of Saudi intelligence, the expensive shoes, the cold, military posture. He held a silenced pistol. "Sultan," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "The Emir wants his shame ended. He says it is better you die in the West than live to destroy the house." I looked at him, and I didn't feel fear. I felt a profound pity. I looked at the gun, then back at his eyes. "You can kill the body," I told him, "but you cannot kill the light I carry. If you shoot me, I go to my king. But if you let me speak, you might find your own way to the truth." The man hesitated. For a split second, I saw the matrix flicker in his eyes. He lowered the gun, turned his back, and vanished into the Berlin fog. I knew then that the message wasn't just reaching the victims, it was reaching the executioners. The channel grew into a movement. I started receiving thousands of encrypted messages every day. "Sultan, I am a pilot in the royal flight. I saw the man in white in a dream over the Red Sea. Prince, I am a maid in your aunt's palace. We are meeting in the laundry room to read the book." I realized that I was no longer a prince of territory or oil. I was a prince of a digital reformation. The king was bypassing the borders and the clerics. He was going straight into the hearts of the desperate. But I knew the cleaners wouldn't miss a second time. I knew my father was preparing a final blow. I looked at the cross on my table and realized that my time as a digital ghost was coming to an end. The final confrontation was approaching, and this time, there would be no desert to hide in. You have to understand the reach of the House of Saud. Their power isn't just in the oil fields, it's in the fiber optic cables, the diplomatic lounges of London, and the high-tech surveillance rooms of global security firms. When they decide a man must be deleted, the world becomes very small, very quickly. For months, I had been a digital ghost, but the cleaners were no longer just sending lone assassins with silenced pistols. They had turned the city of Berlin into a trap. My bank accounts, the few I had managed to set up under false names, were frozen. My encrypted satellite pings were being triangulated by drones that didn't technically exist. I felt the noose tightening. Every time I stepped out for bread, I felt 1,000 eyes on my neck. The Matrix was no longer just a religious system, it was a technological net designed to drag me back to the Deep Council. I realized that the Royal Council wasn't just afraid of my message, they were terrified of the leaks. People from within the palace were sending me documents, evidence of the massive corruption and the secret lives of the guardians of the faith. I was no longer just an apostate prince, I was a whistleblower for the kingdom of God. One morning, I saw my father on the news. He was standing next to a high-ranking European official. They were talking about security cooperation and extradition treaties. I knew what that meant in the language of the elite. They were buying the right to take me back. The kingdom had labeled me a terrorist and a money launderer. They used the West's own laws to hunt me. Suddenly, the police weren't my protectors, they were potential captors. I had to leave the refugee shelter. I had to move into the gray zone, the abandoned warehouses and the squats where the undocumented live. I remember sitting in a basement in the East Side, the walls covered in graffiti, sharing a space with 3 men from Somalia. They didn't know I was a prince. They only knew I was the guy who prays to the man in white. One night, one of them, a man named Omar, handed me his phone. "Sultan," he said, his eyes wide. "They are talking about you on the Arabic news. They say you are a traitor. They say anyone who helps you is an enemy of the people." I looked at the screen. My father was offering a $50 million reward for information leading to my safe return. In that squat, $50 million could buy the lives of every person in the building 1,000 times over. I looked at Omar. He looked at me. The silence in that room was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Then, Omar turned off the phone. "We are brothers of the desert, Sultan," he said. "Gold cannot buy a man's soul if he has seen the truth." The Royal Council deployed Pegasus, the most advanced spyware in the world, to find me. They didn't need to see me, they just needed one person I contacted to click a link. I had to go dark. No more laptops. No more satellite bridges. I began to use the oldest communication method in history, human couriers. The underground network of invisible people, the cleaners, the taxi drivers, the hotel maids, became my nervous system. Gabriel's brothers were everywhere. A maid in a luxury hotel would leave a handwritten note under a trash can. A taxi driver would drop off a bag of groceries with a flash drive hidden inside a loaf of bread. This was the digital reformation going primitive. The kingdom's shadow was long, but it couldn't see in the dark corners where the humble lived. I started receiving videos from secret house churches in Riyadh and Jeddah. They were filming themselves in basements, their faces covered, whispering, "Sultan, we are with you. The king is here." The Royal Council was using billions of dollars in technology, but they were being defeated by the prayers of the poor. The Matrix was failing because it couldn't account for sacrifice. I knew I couldn't stay in Berlin. The cleaners had located my general district. I decided to meet my final contact, a man who promised me a way into the Swiss mountains, where the global hunt would be harder to sustain. The meeting was at midnight, by the Spree River, under a bridge that smelled of iron and old rain. I moved through the shadows, my heartbeat syncing with the man in white's peace. As I approached the pillar, a figure stepped out. It wasn't my contact. It was General Mansour, the head of my father's personal security. A man who had taught me how to ride horses when I was 6 years old. A man who had been like an uncle to me. He didn't have a gun. He had a cigar and a look of profound exhaustion. "Sultan," he said, the smoke curling around his gray beard. "Look at you. You look like a beggar. You have the blood of kings, and you are living in the filth of Europe. Is this what your man in white wanted for you? Poverty and fear?" "I have never been richer, Mansour," I replied. "I have a peace that you can't find in your palaces. Why are you here? Are you going to take me back?" Mansour looked at the river. "Your father is dying, Sultan. Not from a heart attack, but from grief. He wants his son. He says if you come back, he will let you live in a villa in Marbella. You can believe whatever you want, as long as you stay silent. This is your last chance. The council has already authorized the permanent solution if I fail tonight." I looked at Mansour. I saw the gold on his wrists and the fear in his eyes. He was a prisoner of the kingdom just as much as I was, but he didn't have the keys to his cell. "Tell my father that I love him," I said. "But tell him that I cannot return to the grave. I have seen the true king, and once you have seen him, you can't unsee him. I would rather die under this bridge as a child of God than live in a villa as a slave to the lie." Mansour sighed. He pulled out a small device, a GPS jammer. He flipped it on. "You have 5 minutes, Sultan. The drones are blinded for 300 seconds. After that, I have to report your location. Go. Run to your king." He turned his back on me, just as Gabriel had done in the desert. I realized then that the chosen one isn't just a person, it's a ripple effect. Every time I stood my ground, the matrix cracked a little more for someone else. I vanished into the dark, cold streets of Berlin, heading toward the mountains. The hunt was now global, but I wasn't running from death anymore. I was running toward the final broadcast. Ozer Dillarum, Janlies Belumu de Thailandermism. Chapter 8I, Spirituel Ipek Yolu, O 10.000 Karakterlik Derinlik Ve Sisilmus Gishi Atmospherial Yenadin, Sak Daha de Tali Bur Si Kilda Kalim Aliorum. After the encounter with Mansour under the Berlin Bridge, I realized that the kingdom's shadow was a beast that could only be defeated by a network with no heart to pierce and no center to crush. If I was to dismantle the Matrix, I couldn't just be a lonely voice on a screen in a basement, I had to build a bridge between the two worlds I inhabited. I called it the Spiritual Silk Road. I began to connect the dots between the desperate souls I had met in the refugee camps and the secret believers still hiding in the marble corridors of Riyadh. We weren't just sharing a message anymore, we were building a global nervous system for the truth. I used the dark web not for the trade of drugs or weapons, but to distribute the only thing the Royal Council feared more than an armed coup, the word. We smuggled digital seeds, tiny micro-SD cards hidden inside the hollow beads of prayer necklaces, or encrypted files disguised as harmless architectural blueprints for new palace expansions. The king had told me I was an ambassador, and I finally understood what that meant. An ambassador doesn't just talk, he represents a government more powerful than the one he is visiting. I was the representative of a kingdom that didn't need oil to keep its lights burning, and its reach was deeper than the House of Saud could ever imagine. The logistics of the Silk Road were beautiful in their simplicity, relying on the very people the kingdom considered background noise. We used the invisible people, the millions of migrant workers who move across the Saudi borders like a quiet, unnoticed tide. I remember a woman named Martha, a Kenyan maid working for one of my cousins, a high-ranking princess. Every month, Martha would send a box of gifts back to her family in Nairobi, old clothes, spices, small trinkets. Hidden inside the stitched lining of those boxes were flash drives containing my latest Prince of Ashes broadcasts and translated Arabic scriptures. Her family in Kenya would then upload them to a secure server in Switzerland, which I could access from my mountain hideout and redistribute globally. The Royal Council was spending tens of millions on the latest surveillance tech to track my satellite pings, but they couldn't track Martha's laundry baskets. They were looking for a lion in the West, a political threat they could drone strike, but they were being systematically undermined by 1,000 ants in their own kitchens and gardens. The Silk Road wasn't built on gold, it was built on the quiet, sacrificial courage of those who had nothing to lose. By the summer of 2022, the reports were coming in like a flood. We called it the Great Wianis. It wasn't just a religious conversion, it was a mass awakening from a deep, hypnotic sleep that had lasted for centuries. I received an encrypted video from a secret group in Jeddah. There were 30 of them, ranging from street vendors to a prominent university professor. They were sitting in a circle in a windowless basement, their faces blurred by the software I had sent them, holding up small, hand-carved wooden crosses. "Sultan," the professor whispered in the video, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and ecstasy, "we were taught from birth that the cross was a lie and a shame. But when we read the book you sent, our hearts caught fire. We realized that our leaders give us rules to keep us small and afraid, but the man in white gives us his life to make us sons. The Matrix is breaking, Sultan. We see the code now." The Royal Council responded with a wave of cleansing. They arrested hundreds of migrant workers on trumped-up charges. They shut down the internet in entire districts. They even began to monitor the dreams of the citizens. Clerics began preaching that seeing a man in white in a dream was a sign of demonic possession. But you cannot arrest a dream. You cannot imprison a frequency. The more they oppressed the people, the faster the Silk Road grew, fueled by the very pressure meant to crush it. In October, the Silk Road faced its greatest existential test. A man claiming to be a high-ranking defector from the Mutaween, the religious police, contacted me through a verified channel. He said he had the names of the cleaners, the hit squads sent to liquidate me in Europe. He claimed he wanted to meet in a small, ancient chapel in the Swiss Alps, near the border. I knew it could be a trap. My brothers in the underground warned me. Sultan, do not go. The shadow is deep in those mountains. It is a setup. But I had a peace that didn't come from a tactical manual. I felt the man in white telling me to go, not to save my life, but to confront the darkness face to face. The chapel was a cold, stone building that had stood for 800 years. Inside, the man was waiting. He looked terrified, but as I approached, I saw the glint of a wire under his robes. He wasn't a defector. He was a Judas, a pawn bought by the council to lure me out. Within seconds, the chapel was surrounded by armored black SUVs. These weren't cleaners with silenced pistols, this was a full-scale tactical team. They didn't want to kill me there, they wanted to take the Prince of Ashes back alive. They wanted to drag me back to the empty quarter and show the world that the Matrix always wins, and that no prince ever truly escapes. The leader of the team walked into the chapel. It was a man I had trained with in the Royal Guard years ago, a man named Zaid. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and a strange, hidden respect. The Emir has lost his patience, Sultan, Zaid said, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm. The Silk Road ends in this graveyard. You are going home to the silence you deserve. Your invisible army cannot save you here. I looked at Zaid. I didn't feel anger. I felt the same overwhelming compassion the king had shown me in the abyss. Zaid, I said, my voice echoing off the ancient stone walls. You think you have trapped me. But you have only entered the room where the king is waiting for you. Do you think I built this network with royal money? I built it with surrender. Look outside. Just as Zaid moved to grab me, the doors of the chapel burst open again. It wasn't more guards. It was the locals. Dozens of them. Swiss farmers, mountain guides, and even a few off-duty local police officers. They had been tipped off by the Silk Road network. In Europe, the kingdom's money could buy politicians in the capital, but it couldn't buy a mountain village that protected its own. The standoff was electric. Zaid knew he couldn't fire on European citizens without starting an international incident that would destroy the kingdom's image. He looked at me, then at the villagers, then back at me. The Matrix was paralyzed by a force it didn't understand, community. This isn't over, Sultan, Zaid hissed as he signaled his team to retreat. You're right, Zaid, I replied. It's just beginning. The Silk Road doesn't end in these mountains. It ends at the throne of the man in white. I walked out of that chapel, protected by the very people I had once considered peasants. I realized then that the Chosen One is never a solitary hero. The king doesn't just provide the message, he provides the family you never knew you had. After the escape from the chapel, I knew the royal council would stop playing games with tactical teams and diplomatic pressure. I had become a tumor in the soul of the kingdom, and they were ready to use the most precise scalpel in their arsenal. I retreated to this cabin, a place where the oxygen is thin and the silence is absolute. But silence is a double-edged sword. It allows you to hear the king, but it also allows you to hear the approach of the shadow. The Silk Road had sent me one last encrypted burst before the grid went dark. Tariq is active. That was all it said. In the halls of the Saudi intelligence, Tariq was more than a man, he was a delete command in human form. He was a ghost who had mastered the art of making the impossible look like an accident. He was the one who ended problems that billions of dollars couldn't solve. I sat there, staring into the embers, and I realized that my life had come full circle. I had started in a palace, surrounded by 1,000 servants, and I was ending in a hut, waiting for a single man to kill me. And yet, as the cold seeped through the cracks in the logs, I felt a warmth in my chest that no palace heater could ever provide. I wasn't waiting for an executioner, I was waiting for a divine appointment. The fire had collapsed into a dull, pulsing red eye by 3 a.m. I didn't wake up to a noise. A man like Tarek doesn't make noise, he moves like smoke. I woke up because the frequency of the room had shifted. The air felt heavy, ionized, as if a thunderstorm were compressed into the four corners of the cabin. There was the smell of gun oil and the biting cold of the outdoors clinging to a tactical suit. I sat up slowly, my heart beating with a calm, rhythmic thud. In the shadows near the door, he stood. Tarek. He was exactly as the legends described, a lean, efficient machine of a man. His eyes were invisible behind tactical goggles, but the muzzle of his suppressed HMK pistol was very visible, a black hole pointed directly at my sternum. "You're a hard man to find, Sultan," Tarek whispered. His voice was a rasp, stripped of emotion, the voice of a man who had long ago traded his soul for a paycheck from the throne. "The council thinks you're a genius. They think you have a secret army. But I see you now. You're just a beggar in a sweater, hiding in the clouds." "I'm not hiding, Tarek," I said, and my voice sounded alien in the small room, rich, steady, and devoid of the fear that usually seasons a man's final words. "I've been waiting. I knew they'd send the best they had to offer. I'm glad it's you." Tarek's finger tightened on the trigger. I saw the slight tension in his forearm. "Don't try to lecture me with your testimony, Prince. I've killed men more pious than you. I've killed men who begged Allah and men who begged the West. None of them walked away. You have 5 seconds. Use them to say goodbye to your man in white." I didn't close my eyes. I didn't bow my head. I looked straight into the darkness where his eyes were. "Tarek, the man in white isn't a dream I had in a Ferrari. He is the one who let you in that door tonight. He's been standing behind you since you crossed the border." "Liar," Tarek hissed. And then, the matrix didn't just glitch, it melted. A vertical line of white light appeared in the center of the room, as if the air itself were being unzipped. It wasn't a flash, it was a presence. The cabin, which had been freezing, was suddenly filled with a warmth that felt like a summer afternoon in the gardens of Riyadh. The scent of wood smoke was replaced by the smell of rain on desert sand, the scent of life. Tarek stumbled. His pistol, the pinnacle of German engineering, simply ceased to function. He tried to pull the trigger, but the metal felt like soft clay in his hands. He fell back against the door, his goggles sliding off his face. The man in white didn't have a face that the human eye could process. It was like trying to look at the sun through a magnifying glass. But the power, it was a weight that pinned Tarek to the floor. It wasn't the power of a fist, it was the power of an absolute, terrifying love. Tarek began to scream, but the sound was trapped in his throat. He was seeing his book of life. He was seeing every soul he had deleted, every life he had extinguished in the name of a crown that was now nothing but ash. I stood up and walked into the light. It didn't burn, it felt like a homecoming. I reached down and placed my hand on Tarek's shoulder. He was vibrating, his tactical gear clinking as he sobbed with a violence that shook his entire frame. The professional cleaner was gone, in his place was a terrified child who had finally realized he was lost in the dark. "Tarek," I said, and the man in white's authority flowed through my words. "You weren't sent here to kill me. You were sent here to be found. The council thinks they are the masters of the shadow, but the shadow belongs to the king. He brought you 3,000 miles just to show you that the blood on your hands can be washed away." Tarek looked up at the light, then at me. His face was a mask of agony. I have killed so many. I have served the lie for so long. There is no grace for a man like me. I am a ghost, Sultan. I am already dead. That's what I thought in the Ferrari, I replied. But the king doesn't care about your past, he cares about your surrender. The crown you serve is a tyrant. The crown I serve is a father. Choose, Tariq. The gun or the grace? Tariq looked at his pistol on the floor. He picked it up, but not to fire. He slowly ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and threw the weapon into the heart of the fireplace. The suppressed barrel hissed as it hit the embers, a symbolic death of the silent hand. The silence that followed the fading of the light was more deafening than the alpine wind. It was the silence of a world being rebuilt from the inside out. As the white radiance retreated into the floorboards, leaving only the smell of rain and ozone, I looked at Tariq. He was no longer the apex predator of the House of Saud. He was a man stripped of his programming. He stared at his hands as if he were seeing them for the first time, realizing they were stained with the blood of 1,000 deleted souls. That night, the kingdom lost more than their most efficient assassin. They lost the very foundation of their reality. They lost the belief that gold and fear can control every heart. What have I done, Sultan? Tariq whispered, his voice cracking like dry earth. I have spent 20 years building a tomb for my own soul. I thought I was the hand of God. I thought the Emir was the shadow of heaven on earth. But I saw him. I saw the man in white. And I am nothing. You are not nothing, Tariq, I said, stepping toward him, my own voice vibrating with the authority of the king. You are a guardian. You were trained by the darkness to know every secret, every passage, and every weakness of the Matrix. The king didn't just save you to give you peace, he saved you to give you a sword. The enemy thinks they have sent a wolf to kill a sheep. They don't realize they have sent a brother to find his king. Tariq looked at the fireplace, where his suppressed pistol was now a mangled piece of hot iron. He stood up, his military discipline returning, but this time, it was directed toward a different throne. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a high-frequency, encrypted satellite radio, a device so advanced it could bypass any firewall on the planet. They are waiting for the confirmation, Tariq said, his eyes locking onto mine with a new, sober intensity. If I don't signal in the next 60 seconds, a secondary strike team will be dispatched to these coordinates. Drones will be over this ridge before the sun hits the peaks. We have to give them what they want. We have to become the ghosts they think we are. I nodded. This was the moment of the Great Deception, the birth of the Digital Reformation's secret vanguard. Tariq keyed the frequency, a direct line to the Deep Council in Riyadh. I watched his face transition instantly back into the mask of the professional killer. His eyes went cold, his jaw set, and when he spoke, his voice was the flat, raspy whisper of the silent hand. Code black. Target eliminated, Tariq said into the receiver. The encrypted static hissed back at him. The Prince of Ashes is no more. High-speed collision on the mountain pass. Body unrecoverable, lost in a deep crevasse near the north face. Vehicle and evidence destroyed by fire. Extraction unnecessary. I am moving to a secondary site for deep cover observation of the local networks. Handing off command to the regional cell. Do not contact me again until I surface. The glitch has been deleted. There was a long, agonizing pause. Then, a single, distorted word came back from the depths of the Riyadh palace, confirmed. Tariq clicked the radio off. Without a second's hesitation, he placed it on the floor and crushed it under the heavy heel of his tactical boot, shattering the kingdom's last tether to his soul. To my father, to the high clerics, and to the royal council, I was finally dead. The Prince of Ashes was a closed file, a tragic story of a wayward son who met a violent end in the Swiss snow. They thought they had finally silenced the glitch in their system. They thought they could go back to their hedonism and their golden cages, secure in the knowledge that no prince ever truly escapes the Matrix. "They will come for you eventually, Sultan," Tarek said, his voice now clear and filled with the resonance of a free man. "They will find out the body wasn't there. They will see the digital ghosts on the Silk Road. But when they do, they won't find a fleeing refugee anymore. They won't find a man hiding in a hut. They will find a fortress. I know their tactics. I know their codes. I know their hearts. I will build you a wall that no cleaner can climb." I looked out the window as the sun began to bleed over the alpine peaks, painting the snow in shades of violet and gold, the same colors I had seen in the celestial hall. I felt a surge of power that made the Ferrari's engine seem like a toy. I was no longer running. I had the secrets of the Deep Council, the loyalty of their deadliest assassin, and the favor of the King of Kings. "Tarek," I said, turning to him as the first light of the new world hit my face. "The Silk Road is too slow. It was meant to hide the truth, but the time for hiding is over. We aren't staying in the mountains. We are going to the heart of the Matrix. We are going to take this message directly into the palaces, into the barracks, and into the mosques. My father thinks his son is ash. It's time he finds out that ash is the only thing that can start a fire he cannot put out." Tarek bowed his head, not as a servant to a prince, but as a soldier to his commander. "Where the king leads, I follow, Sultan. Let's go show them what real power looks like." We stepped out of the cabin and into the blinding white of the morning, two ghosts ready to haunt a kingdom until it woke up. While Tarek and I were forging our alliance in the alpine snow, a different kind of fire was consuming the heart of Riyadh. My father, the Emir, had received the code black confirmation from Tarek's compromised radio. He officially believed his firstborn son was dead, erased, deleted, turned into a nameless ghost in a Swiss crevasse. He had achieved what the royal council demanded, the preservation of the purity of the House of Saud. But the Matrix had failed him in the most intimate way. He didn't find the piece of a job well done, he found a silence so heavy it began to crush his chest. Every night, surrounded by the wealth of 10 nations, he realized that all the oil in the kingdom could not buy back a single heartbeat of the son he had ordered to be executed. He was haunted. Not by ghosts of the dead, but by the truth of the living. My words from the Deep Council, "He is more alive than anyone in this room," had become a spiritual virus, eating away at the golden foundations of his reality. He looked at the high clerics and saw only puppets. He looked at his other sons and saw only shadows. He began to wonder if the man in white had actually stood in that cabin, and if Tarek, his most lethal shadow, had finally encountered a light he couldn't put out. In a moment of desperation that bordered on heresy, my father did something that would have seen any other man in the kingdom executed. He turned to the very technology he had once used to hunt me. He ordered his personal tech intelligence officer, a man who owed his life to the Emir, to open a dark bridge. This was an unmonitored, untraceable satellite frequency, a digital wormhole that bypassed the kingdom's multi-billion-dollar firewall. He didn't want to talk to a prince, he wanted to talk to the ghost of the Reformation. He needed to know if the lie he had told himself, that I was dead, was the only truth he had left. I was sitting in a secure safe house in Zurich, the cold alpine air still clinging to my sweater. Tarek was standing by the window, his eyes scanning the street for the telltale signs of a cleaner team. Suddenly, one of my encrypted burner phones, one I hadn't used in weeks, began to vibrate. It didn't just ring, it pulsed with a unique, high-level royal encryption code. A code I knew by heart. It was the Emir's private ping. Tarek noticed it instantly. His hand flew to the weapon at his hip, his body tensing into a combat crouch. "Sultan," he whispered, his voice jagged. "That's a direct palace ping. They've bypassed the Silk Road. We're compromised." "No," I said, staring at the screen. The blue light reflected in my eyes. They don't know where we are. They fear we are everywhere. This isn't a strike, Tarek. This is a cry for help from a drowning king. I answered the call. I didn't say hello. I didn't use a title. I just sat there in the silence, listening to the static of a father's soul. For nearly a minute, there was nothing but the sound of heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. It was the sound of a man who was suffocating in his own palace. Finally, a voice I hadn't heard since I was bound in steel in the deep council broke through. "Sultan," my father whispered. The voice was thin, raspy, stripped of its royal thunder. "If you are a demon haunting this line, tell me now so I can find peace in my madness. But if you are my son, if you are the one who saw the light, speak. I have seen the fire every night since Tarek signaled your end. The gold. Sultan, it is melting on my face, just as you said it would. The weight of the crown is burning my brow." My heart broke. In that moment, he wasn't the emir. He wasn't the billionaire ruler of a global oil power. He was the street sweeper from the Library of Souls. He was a beggar wrapped in silk. "I am here, Father," I said, my voice resonating with a calm that can only come from a man who has already died once. "I am not a ghost, and I am not a demon. I am the son who was lost and has been found. I am the man who had to lose his name to find his soul." I heard a sharp intake of breath. A sob, quickly stifled. Tarek, he lied. My most loyal hand joined the rebellion. I should have known. No man could stand in the presence of what you saw and remain a servant of the sand. "Tarek didn't betray you, Father," I said softly. "He found a king who is greater than any emir. He didn't join a rebellion, he joined a reformation. Why did you call? Is the Aegis satellite already locked on? Is this the final goodbye before you try to delete me again?" My father's voice suddenly shifted. The grief was still there, but the matrix, the system of control he had lived in his whole life, began to speak through him. This was the final temptation, the one designed to pull the chosen one back into the gilded cage. "Sultan, listen to me," he said, his voice gaining a desperate, persuasive edge. "I am tired. The Royal Council is pressing me to name your brother, Faisal, as the new heir. They want to turn this country into a fortress of even deeper darkness. They want a war with the West. But I can stop them. I can protect you. I am making you an offer, the final offer. I will grant you a secret, divine pardon. I will tell the council that I have rehabilitated you in private. I will give you a hidden estate in the mountains of Oman, a paradise of your own. You can have your books, your man in white, and your prayers. I will deposit $10 billion into an untraceable Swiss account in your name. You can live as a god in the shadows, Sultan. You can have your Jesus and your billions. All I ask, all I beg of you, is to stop the broadcasts. Shut down the Prince of Ashes channel. Cut the Silk Road. Stop waking up the people. Let the kingdom stay in its sleep, and you can be the only one who is awake, living in luxury. Isn't that what your Christ wants? For you to have peace in life?" I looked at Tarek. He could hear every word. I saw his jaw tighten. He knew that if I accepted, his family in Jeddah would be safe, his record would be cleared, and we would both be rich beyond the dreams of avarice. The Matrix wasn't trying to kill me anymore, it was trying to buy me. It was offering me a private heaven while my brothers and sisters stayed in hell. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the cold, gray Zurich sky. I remembered the invisible people. I remembered Martha, Gabriel, and the millions who were still trapped in the hypnotic trance of the old world. I remembered the man in white standing on that hill, bleeding for people who hated him. "Father," I said, and I felt the frequency of the King of Kings vibrating in my vocal cords. You are offering me a golden cage to replace a marble one. You are trying to bribe the truth with the very gold that I saw melting in the abyss. But you don't understand. I didn't come back for the money. I didn't come back for a villa or a secret pardon. I came back to tell you that the crown you are wearing is a curse. It is a lead weight around your neck, dragging you into the fire. The peace you are offering me is the peace of a cemetery, quiet, still, and dead. I cannot stay silent while my brothers are starving for the light. I cannot take $10 billion and watch my people drown in the lie. I am not a prince of your house anymore, Father. I am a herald of the kingdom that is coming to replace yours. Keep your money. I have the morning star. The emir's voice went cold, not with anger, but with a profound, terrifying despair. It was the sound of a man who realized he had lost the only thing that mattered. Then you have chosen your end, Sultan, he whispered. The council has already authorized the Aegis satellite strike. They don't need Tariq anymore. They will find your digital signature, and they will erase that entire block of Zurich to get to you. I tried to save you, but you are already dead. I died a long time ago, Father, I said. But today, I am finally alive. The fire is coming for the palace, but the man in white is already at the door. All you have to do is turn the handle. I disconnected the call. The dark bridge went silent. I looked at Tariq. He didn't ask what we were going to do. He just picked up his tactical vest. He's going to use the Aegis, Tariq said. We have less than 20 minutes before they triangulate this ping. No, I said, walking over to my laptop. We aren't running. We've been running since the crash. It's time to stop the Silk Road and start the Reformation. We're going live, Tariq. Directly into every mosque in Riyadh during the dawn prayer. If they're going to erase us, let them do it while the whole kingdom is watching the light. After that final call with my father, the bridges weren't just burned, they were vaporized. I was no longer a fugitive, I was a systemic glitch, and the Matrix was mobilizing its entire orbital power to delete me. Tariq was watching the Aegis satellite, a kinetic weapon capable of a precision strike from space. Sultan, Tariq said, his voice trembling not with fear for himself, but for the mission. If you keep this signal open for 3 more minutes, the algorithm will lock. There will be nothing left of this block but a smoking crater. I smiled. Fear had died inside that Ferrari in 2019. Let them lock on, Tariq, I said. We are already ghosts. But this signal is eternal. The digital key in my hand was about to trigger the Martyrs Protocol. For months, the Silk Road had been planting back doors into the kingdom's infrastructure, not to steal money, but to seize the airwaves. It was dawn in Riyadh. Just before the call to prayer, I was going to jam a dagger into the heart of the Matrix. In Riyadh, as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, thousands of men were gathering in the Grand Mosque. The massive high-definition screens, usually reserved for royal decrees, suddenly flickered. The state-controlled audio system hummed with a new frequency. And then, I appeared. I didn't have the royal robes. I didn't have the retinue of guards. I sat in that gray bunker in Zurich, wearing a worn-out sweater, with a simple wooden cross around my neck. My face was broadcast onto every screen in the kingdom, from the palace elevators to the public squares of Jeddah. My brothers, my sisters, my voice boomed through the speakers of 1,000 minarets, overriding the official broadcast. You were told I was dead. You were told the Prince of Ashes was a ghost story told by enemies of the state. But look at me. I am Sultan, your brother. And I have come back from the abyss to tell you the truth that the council has spent billions to hide. The Matrix didn't just glitch, it stopped. I saw footage later of men dropping to their knees in the mosques, not in prayer, but in shock. The dead prince was speaking to them, and his words were like fire. "You serve a crown made of oil and fear." I shouted, my spirit vibrating with the authority of the man in white. "You are told that God is a tyrant who demands your blood. But I have stood before the true king. I have seen the fire that awaits those who worship gold, and I have seen the light of the one who gave his own blood so you wouldn't have to. The Matrix tells you that you are slaves. The man in white tells you that you are sons. You have been told that the cross is a shame, but I tell you it is the only bridge out of the fire. The Amir cannot save you. The gold cannot save you. Only the man who walked through the fire to find me on that highway can save you." As I spoke, the Aegis satellite was closing in. Tarek gripped the edge of the desk. 60 seconds, Sultan. The heat signature is peaking. They're initiating the strike sequence. Let them watch. I replied. I began to upload the final files, the library of souls data. I broadcast the secret names of the believers within the palace, the corruption of the clerics, and the maps to the secret underground churches. I was giving the people the keys to their own cages. Look for the man in white in your dreams. I cried out, my voice reaching a crescendo as it echoed through the streets of Riyadh. The prince is dead, but the spirit is alive. The desert is about to bloom. Tarek dove across the room, tackling me away from the terminal just as the floor began to vibrate. I saw the screen go red. Lock confirmed. In Riyadh, the broadcast cut to static. In Zurich, the sky didn't turn dark, it turned white. A kinetic rod, traveling at Mach 10, struck the warehouse with the power of a tactical nuke. The world became a roar of shattering concrete and heat. As the roof collapsed, I didn't feel pain. I felt the same warmth I had felt in the Ferrari. I felt the man in white standing over us, a shield of light in the middle of the debris. The council thought the martyr's signal was my end. They thought they had finally deleted the glitch. They spent the next day celebrating the destruction of the terrorist cell in Europe. But they didn't realize that by killing me on live television, they had made me a god in the eyes of the people. The signal had done its work. The Matrix was permanently compromised. Across the kingdom, men were taking off their royal pins. Maids were whispering the name of Jesus in the hallways of the palaces. The Silk Road had become a revolution. Deep in the rubble of that Zurich warehouse, a hand moved. Tarek coughed, pushing aside a slab of concrete that should have crushed him. He looked at me, his face covered in gray dust, but his eyes were shining. "We did it, Sultan," he whispered. The signal reached the desert. I stood up, shaking the dust from my sweater. I looked up through the hole in the roof, toward the morning stars. I had no billions. I had no palace. I was a man with no name and no home. "We're not done, Tarek," I said. The signal was the call. Now, it's time for the gathering. The Prince of Ashes was gone. The Apostle of the Desert had been born. This is the final, ultra-condensed and high-impact version of Chapter 12. This draft focuses on the visceral imagery of the Matrix collapsing and Sultan's final metamorphosis from a political threat into a spiritual legend. The world watched the explosion on a 5-second delay. The royal council cheered in their high-walled villas, believing the glitch had finally been purged from the system. They thought that by turning a warehouse into a tomb, they had buried the truth under 1,000,000 tons of concrete. But they forgot the fundamental law of the kingdom I now serve: you cannot kill what has already died. The Aegis strike took the walls, it took the servers, and it took the physical evidence of my life in Europe. But it couldn't touch the frequency. The martyr's signal was already etched into the souls of millions. While the clerics were laughing in Riyadh, the desert was beginning to tremble. The king had shielded us in that crater, not so we could hide, but so we could witness the final collapse of the golden lie. I stood up from the rubble, and as I shook the dust of the old world from my shoulders, I realized the mission was no longer about broadcasting a message. It was about becoming the message. We didn't seek safety in the West. We didn't ask for political asylum. Using the Silk Road's most hidden veins, Tariq and I began the journey back into the mouth of the lion. 1 month later, I stood in the back of the Grand Mosque in Riyadh during the Friday prayers. I wore the salt-stained clothes of a common laborer, the invisible people I had once looked down upon. I was surrounded by the scent of 1,000 men, the heavy heat of the desert, and the rhythmic chanting of the state-mandated prayers. No one recognized me. To the elite, I was part of the furniture. But as the imam began to preach about the divine right of the throne, I saw the glitches in every row. I saw a royal guard whispering a name that wasn't in the official text. I saw a merchant clutching a small wooden cross beneath his silk sleeve. I saw the fear in the eyes of the clerics as they looked out at a crowd that was no longer under their spell. The matrix was still standing, but its soul had been replaced. I leaned against a marble pillar, the same one I used to stand by as a prince, and I felt the man in white whisper, "The walls are already down." I entered the palace through the service tunnels, guided by the very men who used to clean my shoes. Tariq moved like a shadow beside me, neutralizing the high-tech sensors with a flick of his wrist. I walked into my father's private study, a room where empires were bought and sold. My father was sitting by the window, staring out at the empty expanse of the Rub al-Khali. He looked like a man made of glass, ready to shatter at the first touch of the wind. He didn't turn around when I entered. "I knew the Aegis wouldn't take you," he whispered, his voice a ghost of its former power. "The clerics told me you were erased, but the desert told me you were coming home." "I didn't come back for the house, Father," I said, stepping into the center of the room. "I came to tell you that the palace is empty. You are sitting on a throne of shadows. The people have seen the light, and they aren't coming back to the dark." My father finally turned. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see an apostate or a traitor. He saw a man who was truly free. He reached for his crown, a heavy, diamond-encrusted weight, and pushed it across the table toward me. "Take it, Sultan. Lead them. Use your man in white to save the kingdom. Just don't let it fall." I looked at the gold, and I felt a wave of profound pity. "I don't want that crown, Father. I have one that doesn't burn. I didn't come to save the kingdom of Sod. I came to tell you that the King of Kings has already arrived. You can either be the last ruler of a graveyard, or the first son of the morning star." My father stood on the balcony, looking out over the neon skyline of Riyadh. The sun was setting, casting long, violet shadows across the ancient sands. The choice was before him, the gold or the grace. "What do I do?" he asked. "Surrender," I replied. "Not to the rebels or the cameras. Surrender to the man who took the strike for you on that hill. He is the only one who can wash the molten gold off your soul." I left him there, standing on the edge of the world he had built. I don't know if he prayed, but I know that the next day, the Matrix officially broke. He issued a decree of total spiritual freedom. The council was in a frenzy, the clerics demanded my head, but it was too late. The invisible people, the maids, the drivers, the soldiers, simply walked out of their cages. The kingdom didn't fall to a revolution of blood, it dissolved in a revolution of light. My name is Sultan. I was born a prince of a dying world, I died a beggar in a Ferrari, and I was reborn as a witness to the true king. The story you have heard isn't a political thriller or a royal drama. It is a warning. You are living in your own matrix, a world of status, gold, and pride that tells you that you are the master of your fate. But the Ferrari is already on fire. The Aegis is already locked on. I am here to tell you that the gold you worship will be the weight that sinks you in the abyss. But there is a man in white who walks through the fire. He is standing at your door, just as he stood at mine in that alpine cabin. He doesn't want your money. He doesn't want your rituals. He wants you. The Prince of Ashes is gone. The desert is in bloom. The kingdom of God is here. Will you wake up? Tam bu kismi 6-7 kia seeker missin sadis burai. You can either be the last ruler of a graveyard, or the first son of the morning star. My father stood on the balcony of the Al Yamama Palace, a silhouette draped in the finest silk, looking out over the neon skyline of Riyadh. The city below was a sprawling forest of glass and steel, a testament to the power we had built on the backs of the earth's ancient oil. The sun was setting, bleeding into the horizon and casting long, violet shadows that looked like fingers stretching across the ancient sands. The silence between us was the heaviest thing I had ever felt. It was the silence of 33 years of lies, now cracking under the weight of a single truth. The choice was laid bare before him, stripped of its royal pomp and political nuance, the gold or the grace. "What do I do, Sultan?" he asked. His voice didn't sound like the emir of the House of Saud. It sounded like a child lost in a storm. "I have built this world. I have guarded the gates. If I let go, if I follow this man in white, the kingdom will fall into the sand. Everything we are will vanish." "The kingdom is already sand, father," I replied, standing just behind him. "It's a sandcastle waiting for the tide. Surrender. Not to the rebels in the streets, not to the cameras of the West, and not even to the council that fears you. Surrender to the man who took the strike for you on that hill. He is the only one who can wash the molten gold off your soul. He is the only one who can make you a king by first making you a son." I looked at the diamond-encrusted crown sitting on his mahogany desk. It looked like a trinket. I realized then that my father wasn't afraid of losing his power, he was afraid of being seen without it. He was afraid to be just a man standing before a god. I left him there, standing on the edge of the world he had spent his life constructing. I didn't wait for his answer. I didn't need to. I walked out of the palace, through the corridors where the guards lowered their heads, not out of duty, but out of a new, hushed reverence. I don't know if he prayed that night. I don't know if he wept. But I know that the next day, the Matrix officially broke. He didn't abdicate. He did something far more dangerous to the status quo. He issued a royal decree of total spiritual freedom. He dismantled the religious police with a single signature. The council went into a frenzy, their voices screaming of heresy and the end of days. The clerics demanded my head, labeling me the great deceiver. But it was too late. The invisible people, the maids who had prayed in secret, the drivers who had listened to my signal in their cabs, the Sudanese soldiers who had seen the light in their dreams, simply walked out of their cages. They didn't pick up swords. They didn't burn the palaces. They simply stopped fearing the men who lived inside them. The kingdom didn't fall to a revolution of blood, it dissolved in a revolution of light. The fear that held the Matrix together had been replaced by a love they couldn't control. Scene: Sultan walks out of the massive palace gates, shedding his royal identity for the final time. He merges into a crowd of common people in the streets of Riyadh. He stops, looks directly into the lens, his face glowing with an internal fire. "My name is Sultan. I was born a prince of a dying world, a child of infinite luxury in spiritual famine. I died a beggar in a crushed Ferrari, pinned under the weight of my own arrogance. And I was reborn as a witness to the true king. The story you have heard isn't a political thriller. It isn't a royal drama. It is a warning. You are living in your own matrix. You might not have a palace in Riyadh, but you have your own gold and your own pride. You have the status you've spent your life building, the career you've sacrificed your family for, the religious rituals you perform to keep the silence at bay. You tell yourself that you are the master of your fate, that your bank account is your shield, and that your title is your soul. But I am telling you, the Ferrari is already on fire. The Aegis is already locked on. Every luxury you cling to, every lie you tell yourself to feel safe, is just more molten gold that will cling to you when you step into the abyss. It will be the weight that sinks you. But there is a man in white who walks through the fire. He is standing at your door right now, just as he stood at mine in that alpine cabin when the assassin's gun was at my head. He doesn't want your money, he owns the galaxies. He doesn't want your rituals, he wants your heart. He doesn't want your performance, he wants your presence. He took the strike for you. He paid the debt you couldn't even calculate. He is the king who became a servant so that you, a servant, could become a son. The Prince of Ashes is gone. The desert is in bloom. The kingdom of God is here. I have broken my matrix. Will you wake up?